Hello everybody. I'm going to show you today what to do when you make something and you want to trim the bottom, but it's not a shape that lends itself to trimming. So I have here a big ballooned out pot that's going to be perfect for a horsehair raku, but it's not really practical to balance it on this lip and trim it. So the lesson today is how to trim on a chuck, and that is applicable to a lot of different forms. It's an extra step, it's a lot of extra work, so when we can avoid it, we do. But there are just situations where you want to trim something that is hard to trim, and this is a good solution. So we're going to start with a generous amount of clay, about 4 or 5 pounds, to make a chuck. You might as well make it sturdy. I've got it on a bat because I'm going to trim another moon jar shape later today. I want to be able to just take the chuck off the wheel, set it aside and cover it and do some other work. So usually I just throw the chuck straight on the wheel head, but if you think you're going to kind of trim something, do something else, and then come back, it just saves you a couple minutes throwing it on a bat. I don't really enjoy bisque-fired chucks, so they have a couple of applications, but generally speaking, I really prefer to make a chuck fresh every time, and that way I can make the shape perfectly conform to the shoulder of a bottle or whatever it is that I'm trimming. So we're going to center up. It doesn't have to be perfect at the bottom. It just has to be perfect at the top, but it's worth it just to get it perfectly centered. And we're trying to make the reverse profile of the top of whatever it is we're trying to trim. So this is a bottle, so I need to make an opening in the middle that the neck of the bottle fits into. And this doesn't really need to have a floor in it, so I'm just going to go ahead and open all the way to the wheel head. And I'm going to pull out a little wider than the neck of the bottle. And then I want to pull this thick wall up enough that there's enough clearance that the neck of the bottle isn't going to be sitting on the bat. So I don't need to make it really tall. That's more than enough. And then I'm thinking about the curvature of the top of that bottle. I'm going to create the reverse curvature on this really thick wall. So that's almost there already. Of course, we don't want to leave it just sloppy and wet because then the bottle will get stuck. So I'm going to take a minute and use the ribs and get this all dried out really nicely. Oops. This is probably a little bit steep. When I'm looking at the shoulder of this bottle, it's quite broad. So I'm going to press down a little bit and really try to, in my mind, mimic the shape. That's looking better. And now it's just a matter of getting all the goop off. So I'm holding the rib at 90 degrees to the surface of the pot. So all that it's doing is scraping material off there. I don't want to redistribute it somewhere else. I want to just scrape it off. Probably most important at this outer edge here. And the inner edge. Even if you do a really great job of drying these things off, your piece will sometimes stick to it. You'll get like a little suction going. Don't panic and don't try to just yank it off of there. What you can do is take a needle tool and make a hole at the base, and that will let the air in so that it's easy to pop your piece off if you've made a vacuum by mistake. All right. So looking at that, I think it's going to fit really well. The cool thing about a soft chuck is if it doesn't fit really well, I can come in and just take my fingers and change the shape. I can push it up and make it steeper. I can squish it down. I can use a trim tool on it. Just modify it however you need to make the most cradling, supportive structure you can, so that you can trim comfortably and you're not worrying about your piece going flying. So let me get my hands clean and I will show you how to mount your piece on there. This should be interesting because when I was blowing out the form to make this big wide bottle, I was working quick. I was trying to do it all in one take, and I ended up throwing it a little bit off center. So, you know, if your piece is perfectly centered, it'll fit the chuck great, and it almost centers itself. This one, I'll probably have to work at it a little bit more to get it just so. And that's right, it's probably actually more instructive for it to take a little more effort. So here we go. This again is the piece that we're going to invert. I'm going to run the wire back under it, make sure my hands are dry. And very carefully with big broad hand surfaces, I'm going to pick this up and invert it. And you can see it's got a pretty wide base and it's not super attractive. So I think if we curl that in so it has a smaller base and kind of finishes its shape, it'll make a much more successful form. So I'm going to gently, gently, gently lower it down onto the chuck. And what I want to check is partly right left, but I also want to see if this plane here is level. So I'm going to put a finger above it and I'm going to show you how it's not level. It's touching, not touching, touching, not touching, touching. So I'm going to scoot it, sort of lift it and twist it, or tip it over and test it again. Touching, not touching, touching, stopping it. Probably my chuck could have benefited from a little bit of torching just because it's acting a little extra sticky, but that's pretty close. You can see right and left, this form isn't perfectly balanced, but the thing that I'm more interested in is that this floor is level, because what that means is it's going to keep the same kind of level and it's not going to have a weird jump in the shape as I go up the profile. So my goal is to bring this flat area that the pot will sit on in a little bit narrower and round out the rest of the shape. It's a really easy trim job. You just use your wider trim tool and you're just going to use the flat end of it. Sometimes I'll come in and start with some little tentative cuts with the narrow part just to make sure that everything is feeling secure. The other thing you can do to help yourself is to put something like a jar lid or a bottle cap on this surface to give yourself almost like a little ball bearing surface that you can press down on and keep your piece down to the chuck. I don't really think I need it. It might be good instructions to do it. So if I can spot it quickly, I will throw it on there, and indeed I can. So a little jar lid, set that on the center, and then my finger can ride in that jar lid. It's helpful if it's more centered. Doesn't have to be perfect, but. Okay, so this keeps it down onto the chuck. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and start working this curve. And I wanna take little thin cuts. I don't wanna overpower it. So now that flat area is much smaller. And I'm working on removing all the sort of hesitations in the curve. When I start the cut, I have my hand really loose on the tool because I actually want, this is different from a lot of other trimming, I want the tool to ride up and down and follow what's happening if there's eccentricity. I don't want to be like, all right, no, we're going to be here at this point in space and lock in, because my goal is not so much to create a foot like I would on a bowl. I'm just trying to round out and finish the curve. And so I want to kind of blend from what's thrown to what's trimmed. Now, I was holding this tool the way I said not to in my trimming video, which is in my hand this way, and it was fine, but it's leaving a really rough surface. I'm going to come to the more correct way of holding it like a pencil, and hopefully that's going to give me a little bit of a nicer surface as I trim. I don't know if it's evident on the camera, but in real life, I can assure you that I'm getting a much more burnished, smooth looking surface, not a grainy raised surface when I hold the tool with the correct bevel angle. So just barely engaging the cut and starting my way up. That's looking so much nicer. This sort of parallels what's going on the top of the form. It kind of comes up more vertically and then dives horizontally, not in a perfectly sort of spherical way. And I'm going to just soften that angle, that articulation just a little bit. I'm going to take a little more material off. I've got to be really careful because remember, this was a straight cylinder that got blown way out. And if I get carried away, I might discover that I don't actually have that much thickness to work with here. Everything I'm doing at this point is just for making myself happy with the way it looks. There's no functional reason for any of this. In fact, these horsehair raku pots, their main function is just to be beautiful. Okay. Thank you, little jar lid. I've had that thing forever. I think it was off of one of those Starbucks bottled mocha frappuccino kind of drinks that I wouldn't be that interested in drinking myself, but I've held on to that lid for a long time. There are a couple little goobers here. I'm going to carefully trim them off. I was really more just lifting the loose pieces off. And one more little pass here. I want to use the rib to recompress this whole surface. Really, that bevel angle took care of most of it, but I want it to look very similar to the rest of the pot, and I did finish the rest of the pot with a rib. So I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to clean this rib off. I certainly don't want to put moisture on the pot. And we'll just finish this thing off. So it can be challenging to get your piece recentered on a chuck, and it feels like a lot of extra work, but it lets you do things that you can't do other ways. If you just wood knife off the bottom, you're going to always have a sharp corner, and then it's just not going to have this nice, almost hand-built look to it. So here I go, just rounding this corner. I'm bending my rib to conform to the curve, and I'm keeping it really low so that it's more burnishing than scraping. I'm not trying to remove material at all. And I'm going to do the bottom just a little bit. Somehow I introduced a little bit of water there, but that's going to be okay. Now I've got it bent around that curve, so I'm just kind of working it. All right, I like that. I think that's going to end up burnishing really, really beautifully and taking the terra sigillata beautifully, which sets you up for a nice surface when you go to apply horsehair or feathers or really any of the alternative firing techniques that don't involve glaze. You just want to have a beautiful, silky, smooth surface so that all the focus of your eye comes straight to the decoration. I will show you how to get it off the chuck just so you see that it can happen. So I'm going to set this bat aside. So really, you just want to make sure your hands are broad and on as big an area as possible. And just kind of lift and twist, and there it goes. And it hasn't actually marked the pot at all. It was a really nice fit, and it held it really securely and did everything that I wanted it to do. And that's the profile now that it's been trimmed, which would be really hard to accomplish without trimming on a chuck. I'm going to set this aside. The state of the clay was leather hard, maybe slightly hard leather hard, but basically just your standard leather hard stiffness, and you don't want to go too soft. I love to trim platters and bowls and things with the clay almost soft enough that you could just ball up the trimmings and throw them again. When you're going to be inverting onto a chuck, it's worth letting it get a little bit stiffer, especially up there in the shoulder. Thanks so much for watching this, and I hope you enjoy trying to trim on a chuck, and hope that it really enhances the beauty of your pieces. I've already shown you how to trim on a chuck, but I thought I would go ahead and trim the moon jar that I made in 2 pieces on this same chuck, just to get an idea of how you can reuse a freshly thrown chuck. I'm just going to make sure that it feels fairly dry. I've got my moon jar here. This needs more than just rounding out. It's going to need an actual foot, so it might be a little bit more interesting. Also, this hole is too big to fit in the original chuck. If I had bisque fired this, it would be pretty useless, but since I haven't, I can just go like this and make the opening bigger. So a little bit of moisture added, so all I'm going to have to do is one little scrape to get it back where it's useful again. And when I'm all done with the chuck, I'm just going to be able to put it back in the bag and use it as clay for a real project later. All right, clean those hands and go ahead and mount this thing on the chuck. Run the wire back under it just to make sure it's not going to be a problem to get it off of there. I know this one's stretched out, so I'm going to have to be really careful in how I handle it. Come in for a landing. And this would probably work, but what I've discovered after putting this down here is that it is touching right near the neck, and there's a big gap everywhere else. So I had the nice wide opening for the piece that I had that had a broader shoulder. This one is a little bit more sloping. So this is what's really cool. I can just take this and press upward on the outside, and that's going to change that angle, come away really slowly so it gets back centered. And hopefully that's going to contain the pot a little bit better. Oh yeah. That looks great. That's going nowhere. I'm still probably going to use the little jar lid technique to hold it still. Let's see how well it's sort of self-centered. Really not bad. So I'm going to check for height, and it's off on the height front, so I'm going to stop the wheel when it gets to here and tip it. I'm going to have to lift, just slightly adjust that angle. Look at that. That's sitting perfectly into the chuck. So perfect. I'm ready to do a foot on here. And this is going to be trimmed just like a bowl would be trimmed. I don't want to go too narrow on this because it'll just be a little bit precarious looking. I feel differently about these than the ones that have the rounded bottom. So I still want to think about this almost like I think of a bowl. Got my hold down. I'm going to trim this up. And that's about as narrow as I feel comfortable going for that foot. Now what I need to do is get it trimmed down so that I can create a really pleasing curve from the equator up to the foot. Always when you're trimming, you're not wasting time if you stop and get a different perspective. You got to get your head down there. When we look like this, we can't really see what the form's doing. Okay, so I'm going to get all these little loose trimmings off of here. May have to take one more little pass with the tool to clear them off, but really light. I'm not going to try to remove a lot more. Just want to pick up the loose goobers. And I'm really liking that shape. So now I'm going to finish the foot. I'm going to angle this foot inward a little bit so it looks a little more elegant, like it's up on tippy toes. I'm leaving a little bit of a shadow line where the foot meets the pot. To me, that makes a big difference. I love the little detail, the little shadow, the little place for the glaze to pool. All those factors are really nice. Of course, if I'm burnishing and putting horsehair raku, glaze isn't an issue, but it's just kind of revealing my thought process. Part of the reason I'm getting so many pieces coming around and getting stuck is I like to trim a little bit on the wet side. It causes me some amount of heartache when I have to mess around so much, but I like the way it feels. I like the way the clay just comes off in long ribbons. I hate trimming when it's coming off in little short chunks and it's the tool wants to catch. So I'm at this point going to put my trust in the security of this chuck and go ahead and hollow out the inside of the foot. I remember when I made this, I left a ½ an inch on the bottom so that I'd be able to trim out a foot ring. So I'm going to bank on that still being the case. Looking at the way I wired off, it should be. All right, I'm just going to do the final refinements here. And I will come back with a rib in a minute and smooth this out a little bit. Because I'm going to be burnishing and putting terracige on there, I need to make it as close to perfect as I can. All right. Even though this isn't going to be a functional piece, I still want to reduce the likelihood that it's going to chip on the bottom. So I just kind of docked that corner a little bit. I'm going to dock this corner a little bit. Just a little tiny bevel. And then I'm going to use my finger to round out the foot. Rounded shapes are always stronger and safer than shapes that have corners. Think about a chicken egg and how thin that shell is, and yet it can get shipped to your grocery store and not break. All right, I'm using my yellow rib, making sure I'm keeping that edge clean, and I'm just going to kind of burnish with it. I don't want there to be a big contrast between the part that's already ribbed and the part that I trimmed. It is important to keep cleaning off the surface of the rib so that you don't sort of stick new goobers in different places. All right, I can still see a little bit of the hint of trimming there, but at this point I'm feeling pretty good about the way that looks. The foot's trimmed nicely, the clay's compressed on the surface, so I'm going to just hope that terracige gelata takes care of that little bit of evidence that it was trimmed. And otherwise that should be good to go. I want to show you that it will come off of the chuck or if it doesn't come off the chuck, I want to show you what to do about it. So let me have a place ready to set it down. That's fairly clean. Whenever you're picking up something like this, you don't want to have to kind of juggle it. So a lot of times I will lift it with my hands in an awkward position. I don't know if that sound effect was as awesome through the camera as it was in real life, but I got a total boom kind of sound. And this chuck could be used yet another time to trim another pot. I don't have anything else to trim, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut this off and put it back in a bag for another day. But that's trimming on a chuck, and you can trim pretty large pieces. You just have to make a bigger chuck, and the more you can have the shape of this conform to the shape of the pot, the better the surface area, the more it distributes the pressure, and just does a better job of not distorting your piece when you're trimming. Thanks a lot.